I'll never forget the morning it all started. I was sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, when HOA Karen herself strutted up my driveway in high heels that clicked louder than her voice. She had a bright red folder in one hand and that smug little grin she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. Without so much as a good morning, she dropped the folder onto my table. "You've been fined," she said, drawing out each word like she was savoring it. I flipped open the notice, expecting the usual nonsense about grass being too long or the paint on my shed being non-compliant. But this time, the number stopped me cold. $1,000, I laughed, thinking it had to be a typo. But her expression told me otherwise. "Failure to comply," she added, crossing her arms. "You have 30 days to pay, or we foreclose." Now, I'd dealt with HOA fines before. Everyone in the neighborhood had. $100 here. A few hundred there. But $1 million fine, that wasn't just absurd, it was impossible. It was a message. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce some arbitrary rule, she was trying to break me. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as she marched back down my driveway, satisfied like she'd just signed my death sentence. To them, I probably looked like a dead man walking. After all, who could fight the HOA? Especially one run by Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our community. But here's what Karen didn't know. While she was busy building her little empire of fines and threats, I'd been paying attention. I'd seen her overstep before, squeezing families until they either paid up or moved out. But I wasn't like the others, because unlike them, I held a card Karen didn't even realize was in play. The very ground she thought she ruled over, the land the entire HOA operated on, wasn't hers to control. And with one signature I could flip the balance of power upside down. So when I looked at that $1 million fine, I didn't see defeat. I saw an opportunity. Karen thought she'd just destroyed me. What she'd really done was give me the perfect reason to pull the trigger on a plan I'd been quietly preparing for years. She wanted to bury me under her fake authority. But instead, she'd just given me the excuse to bury the entire HOA. The days following that outrageous fine felt like living under siege. Each morning, another brightly colored envelope appeared on my doorstep, each one thicker, bolder, and nastier than the last. Karen didn't stop at 1 million, she kept piling it on. Accumulated violations, she called them. By the end of the week, the so-called debt had ballooned to nearly $1.3 million. Of course, none of it made any sense. The supposed violations were laughable. One claimed my truck wasn't aesthetic enough for the neighborhood. Another insisted my shed's roof angle was non-conforming. And my personal favorite? A citation for unregistered ducks. That one made me laugh out loud. I didn't even own ducks. But behind the absurdity was something darker. This wasn't about ducks, trucks, or sheds. This was about power. Karen wanted me gone. She'd tried intimidation, fines, and threats of foreclosure before, but this time she was going for the jugular. Neighbors started whispering. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 board members bragging about how Karen was finally going to make an example out of him. Families who had once waved at me from across the street now avoided eye contact, fearful that standing near me would put a target on their backs. That's how deep Karen's influence ran. She thrived on fear. But fear works both ways. What Karen didn't know was that while she was stacking fines, I was stacking facts. I spent late nights at the county records office, poring over dusty ledgers and digital files. Most people would never think to look past their own deed, but I knew better. Years ago, when I bought my property, I discovered a curious footnote in the paperwork, an old land lease agreement dating back to the original development of the neighborhood, and as I dug deeper, I uncovered the truth. The HOA's entire claim to authority was built on land they didn't technically own. My property wasn't just a plot within their subdivision, it included the original tract the HOA had been operating on. Without legal access to my land, the HOA had no jurisdiction. In short, they were squatting on my property. It was like discovering the Queen had no clothes. Karen had been marching around throwing her weight like a tyrant, but she'd been standing on a foundation that didn't even belong to her. Still, I didn't move too quickly. Timing was everything. I let Karen and her board dig their hole. Deeper, sending more notices, threatening lawyers and crowing about their inevitable victory. She even scheduled a community violation hearing where she planned to humiliate me publicly, force me to my knees before my neighbors, and announce the foreclosure. But what she thought would be my funeral was about to turn into hers. Deep Pearl. Night before the so-called violation hearing, I barely slept. Not out of fear, but anticipation. Karen had no idea what was coming. For weeks she had strutted around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that I'd be bankrupt by the weekend. She passed out flyers to residents, inviting them to watch justice served. It wasn't a hearing. It was supposed to be my public execution. The next morning I walked into the community center where folding chairs had been lined up in rows. Practically every neighbor had shown up. Some wore smug expressions, clearly buying into Karen's narrative. Others avoided my eyes, nervous but curious. At the front of the room sat Karen and the HOA board, dressed like they were presiding. Over a courtroom, Karen wore a tailored red blazer, her smug grin plastered across her face like she'd already won. "Thank you all for coming," she announced dramatically. "Today we resolve the most flagrant violation this neighborhood has ever seen. Mr. Miller," she didn't even bother to say my first name, "has ignored citations totaling over $1 million. He has refused to comply with our bylaws, and by the authority vested in this association, we will now move forward with foreclosure proceedings." A hush fell over the room. Karen clearly expected applause. Instead, there was only tension. Stood slowly, pulling a manila folder from under my arm. "Actually," I said calmly, "there's just one small problem with your foreclosure plans." Karen raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Oh, really?" I opened the folder, pulled out a stack of documents and held them up. According to county records, dating all the way back to 1972, this entire subdivision, including the land beneath this very building, is part of a tract that I own. The HOA has been operating on my land without legal standing. The room..." Gasped. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. She quickly regained her composure and scoffed. "That's ridiculous. The HOA governs this community. Everyone knows that." "Governance requires authority," I countered. "Authority requires land rights. And unless you can produce a deed that overrides mine, which you can't, your so-called authority doesn't exist. Which means these fines, this foreclosure, this entire circus," I gestured to the room, "isn't worth the paper it's printed on." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some neighbors leaned forward, wide-eyed. Others started whispering, realizing they'd been paying fees to a board with no legal ground to stand on. Karen slammed her fist on the table. "This is nonsense. We've been here for decades. We own this community." I smiled, letting her words hang in the air before delivering the knockout punch. "No, Karen, you've squatted here for decades, and as of today I'm officially terminating the HOA's access to my land. You have 30 days to vacate." The room erupted. Board members turned pale. One of them actually stood up and tried to leave quietly. Neighbors started talking over each other, some shocked, some relieved, some downright cheering. Karen, however, wasn't done. Her face turned crimson and she jabbed a finger at me. "You can't do this. I'll call the county, I'll call the sheriff, "You do that," I cut in. "In fact, I've already filed the paperwork with the county. And the sheriff? He's already aware. So unless you'd like to explain to law enforcement why you've been fraudulently collecting fees and threatening foreclosures on land you don't own, I suggest you sit down." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she had. No comeback. And that silence, that stunned, powerless silence, was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. That much I knew. The very next morning, before the shock from the hearing had even settled, I heard the low rumble of engines outside my property. I looked out my window and nearly laughed. Karen had rallied what remained of the board and a handful of die-hard loyalists. They marched down my driveway carrying clipboards, cameras, and, believe it or not, a giant padlock. The plan was clear. If they couldn't fine me into submission, they were going to physically block me out of my own land. I stepped onto the Porch, coffee in hand, watching the spectacle unfold. Karen, still in her red blazer like it was a suit of armor, shouted at the group, "This property is officially seized by the HOA. No one is allowed entry until our legal team sorts this out." One of the board members nervously tried to secure the oversized lock onto my front gate. That's when I finally spoke. "Careful with that," I said calmly, sipping my coffee. "Tampering with private property is a criminal offense. And unlike you, I actually know the sheriff personally." The board member froze mid-motion, glancing back at Karen. She barked at him to continue, but his hands shook. The confidence from yesterday had evaporated. Now there was only desperation. I walked down the steps, holding a thick envelope. "Since you seem confused about boundaries, let me make it clear. This," I held up the papers, "is a court order confirming what I showed yesterday. The HOA has zero legal claim over my land. You are trespassing, and if you don't leave within 5 minutes, I'll be forced to let law enforcement handle it." For once, Karen didn't have the crowd on her side. Neighbors had gathered along the street, watching the scene unfold like it was the finale of a drama they'd been waiting months to see. Whispers and laughter rippled through the onlookers. People pulled out their phones, recording every second. Karen's face twisted with rage. She jabbed a finger at me. "This isn't over. You think you can embarrass me in front of the community? You'll regret this." But I didn't flinch. Instead, I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "The only one embarrassed here is you. You tried to bury me under $1 million fine. You tried to destroy my reputation. But you forgot one thing, Karen. When you build power on someone else's land, you don't actually have power." She flinched like the words stung more than any threat could. Just then, the unmistakable sound of a sheriff's cruiser rolled. "Top?" The deputy stepped out, hand resting on his belt. He looked from me to Karen, then back at me. "Mr. Miller, is this the situation you warned us about?" I nodded. "Trespassing, attempted seizure of property, and illegal enforcement of an HOA that doesn't legally exist on this land." The deputy turned to Karen, his voice firm. "Ma'am, you and your group need to leave now. If you don't, we'll have no choice but to arrest you." The color drained from Karen's face. She sputtered, "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." The deputy gave a dry laugh. "Not anymore, you're not. At least not here." The crowd burst into applause. Phones recorded every second as Karen's once loyal followers scattered, slipping away one by one. Even her board members abandoned her, leaving her standing alone in the driveway, seething with humiliation. For the first time, she had no one left to command, no bylaws to wave in my face, no fake authority to hide behind. Just Karen, defeated, cornered, and powerless. And that was the moment I knew the HOA's reign was officially over. When the sheriff's cruiser finally pulled away, leaving Karen fuming at the end of my driveway, I felt the weight of months of harassment lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, the air around the neighborhood felt free. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, the entire community knew the truth. The HOA had never legally held authority over my land or anyone else's. Residents who had been quietly suffering under endless fines and absurd rules finally began to speak out. Stories poured in. Families fined for the color of their shutters, retirees threatened over mailbox height, and even veterans harassed for flying the American flag. And now, all those violations were void. Every fee, every penalty, every so-called foreclosure, wiped clean with a single ruling. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping by to shake my hand. One older couple, who'd been too scared to plant a small vegetable garden in their own backyard, thanked me through tears. "You didn't just save your land," they said. "You saved the whole community." As for Karen, her downfall was spectacular. The videos neighbors took of her attempted seizure went viral online. Seeing her in that red blazer, barking orders like a wannabe dictator, only to be shut down by the sheriff, it became instant local legend. Within days, she wasn't just the HOA president, she was the town punchline, and it didn't stop there. With the HOA legally dissolved, county officials launched an investigation into the board's finances. Let's just say, once the audits started rolling in, Karen had much bigger problems than me. I'd like to say she humbled herself, but that's not who she is. She stormed around for weeks threatening lawsuits, insisting she'd get her power back. But the more she fought, the more isolated she became. Her board abandoned her. The neighbors she once intimidated turned their backs. The queen of fines had lost her kingdom. 1 month later, standing on my porch overlooking the acres of land she once thought she controlled, I couldn't help but smile. She'd fined me $1 million, thinking she could break me. Instead, I'd evicted her entire empire with one piece of paper and a truth she couldn't erase. And that's the irony of Karen's downfall. The HOA didn't own me. I owned it. And that's how Karen tried to fine me $1 million, only to lose her entire HOA instead. Poetic justice, right? If you enjoyed seeing Karen's empire collapse, make sure to smash that like button. It helps more people discover these wild HOA battles. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone tried to fine you $1 million? I'll be featuring the best replies in the next episode, and don't forget to subscribe to HOA Karen Stories and hit the notification bell, because trust me, the next story is even crazier. Karen never learns, and you don't want to miss her next downfall.